Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second episode in our podcast series here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, looking at the ideas of liberal nationalism connected very much with both Menachem Begin and, of course, Zev Jabotinsky. In our first episode, I spoke with Dan Meridor. I'm very happy to have with us today another fantastic interviewee and someone who will share her thoughts on the ideas of liberal nationalism and also wider topics connected to that. My guest today is Michal Kotler-Wunsch, the recently appointed CEO of the International Legal Forum, which is a global network of lawyers standing up for Israel and fighting terror, anti-Semitism, and BDS in the international legal arena. Prior to that, she was Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism. She also served in the Knesset as an MK with the Blue and White Party. She has many other strings to her bow and lines on her resume that I could add. I will say, in terms of the legal aspect, she has law degrees from both McGill University in Canada, where she grew up, and Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she was born. Michal, welcome very much to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
So before we get into liberal nationalism, I wanted to ask, because of course this is the Begin Center and we wouldn't be talking about liberal nationalism if there wasn't the strong ideological connection with Menachem Begin. Your own personal connection with Menachem Begin, which is unique, I think.
So I was tremendously honored as a little girl, actually, not recognizing then what an honor it was to be what's known as a bat bait. Actually, when Menachem Begin became the prime minister, and long before that, when he was, well, not in all 29 years, when he was leader of the opposition, but when he actually, in many ways, represented and embodied precisely what we'll move into, is understanding what democracy fundamentally means and entails, including in the creation of a shadow government, if you will, and the responsibility of opposition, not just coalition, in what is a parliamentary system such as Israel's. But in my personal sort of young child's life, I'll share with you, my mom actually was the legislative assistant and secretary at the time for the Likud party, very differently than today, and worked with Menachem Begin very, very closely. And as a result, as a little girl who was raised by a single mom, then in Jerusalem of the 70s, I spent a lot of time in Knesset, in the hallways of Knesset. I do very good impersonations of Arik Sharon, with whom I played hide and seek. And my first understanding of what colored paper was from the Knesset print shop. If anybody knows, the Knesset's sort of protocols are printed on different colored paper. So I was the beneficiary as a little girl then in the 70s of Jerusalem that didn't quite have everything it has today, of actually entering the print shop in Knesset and asking the person in charge to assemble little colored paper books for myself. And of course, have very vivid memories of a young girl in the Knesset cafeteria, allowed to eat pickles all night because everybody was in such distress, as sort of comic relief, as of course the night went on. And it was what's known as the Mahapach. I believe, I don't like the word upheaval. I don't even like the word Mahapach. I actually think maybe we'll drill down on what I do believe it represents internally in Israel's lack of understanding of what happened that night, having a negative connotation of sorts. But of course, with Menachem Begin's victory, actually, in that election, and what was, as a little girl, experiencing euphoria that broke out in dancing and, carried on the shoulders of literal giants of history, I would say, of Israel's history for sure, and of Zionist history as well. Yechiel Kadishai, Esther Aziel Naor, many, many others, Dr. Bader, that really were the foundations of what I think are the true understanding of national liberalism. And one last little anecdote, the beneficiary of being a bat bait, as I said, a welcome guest in the prime minister's house. Once he was in the prime minister's house, a funny memory of, the music conservatory at the time was right next door to the prime minister's house. It had one little guard in the entrance, nothing like today. And one day when my mom was late to pick me up from piano lessons, I, of course, casually walked over to the guard and said, "My mother is late," and entered the prime minister's house, and then became a standing date with Aliza Begin, Allah Zichronah Livracha, in which I would come and play piano until the prime minister and my mother would come home, and enjoy the company of incredible people who really, I think that story for me represents the humility with which they served our people in our country and liberal democracy in the way that Begin fundamentally understood it, and that Eliza too represented with all of her social advocacy that she took on as the prime minister's wife, again, with a humility and commitment to our people, to our country, and to foundational principles that I'm sure we'll discuss. So that's
Yeah.
just the little personal anecdotal piece.
That's wonderful, and I've heard that story before from you, and every time I love hearing. Just I think an important question on terminology, because I think a lot of our audience are Americans, and liberal means something very specific in the American context because they sort of equate liberal and conservative with left and right in the way that we would talk about left and right Israel. And obviously in the Israeli context, we're not talking about that, not only because Begin represented the so-called right in Israeli politics, but also because we're talking about a much broader idea of liberalism, liberal in the sense of, in the way that we talk about liberal democracy, that, something that which, at least in principle, in theory, in the best of times, unites all the mainstream parties in a democratic system. And how do you see the I guess the uniqueness or the potency of Begin's liberalism?
So, to make very clear, in many, many ways, I grew up in Canada, as you mentioned. So I always say small case liberal, meaning
Right,
liberal
exactly, yeah.
values and the foundations, and including in Jabotinsky's, understanding of what's known as Chamishit Hamimim, right? The
Right.
understanding that actually social justice and actually the translation that literally Gachal, before or predating the Likud, was comprised of a party called Haliberalim, the liberals.
Right, right.
Because
So Herut joined with the Liberal Party to form Gachal before it then merged with other smaller parties to become the Likud. Right.
exactly. And that is not sort of an accident of history. It's a very values driven, if you will, amalgamation that then created the Likud party, which which Begin is known to have led all of his then as prime minister. And
Yeah.
what I think is important to understand about that for those listening is, look, in Israel, and as it was founded, in fact, on socialist values, which maybe some of our viewers may not remember. Actually, the differentiation between right and left of the past was economic, right and left, right?
Yep.
So the left was socialist and the
Yeah.
right was, but the differentiation was in economic terms.
Right.
Um,
Socialist versus capitalist, free market. Yeah.
Exactly. And the sort of next stage of differentiation, right and left in Israel, was very much about supporting, I'll say very bluntly, supporting Oslo or not supporting Oslo,
Yeah.
right and left.
Territory, two-state solution, settlements, all that. Yeah.
Meaning it really didn't drill down or revolve around what we consider to be liberal values. And I
Yeah.
think that that's the fundamental misunderstanding, including internally in Israel, of who Menachem Begin was. I mean, I have no better representation of the one simple sentence that he was able to make clear of what he brought into his prime ministership than the question that he himself was asked, what kind of prime minister will you be? Than him saying, Besignon Yehudi Tov, right? In a good Jewish style. But
Yeah.
even that statement is anchored deeply in the notion of social justice, tzedek tzedek tirdof, that he
Yeah.
actually embodied. And I think that we would be remiss if we didn't connect those we'll call them modern liberal permeations of what is deeply steeped Jewish identity in those thousands of years of, sort of predating the terminology that we use now of liberal democracy and so on.
Yeah.
I think that that's very much misunderstood, including about Begin, including about Israel and Israeli politics, and is very important to clarify.
Yeah. And I think it's really important what you say about the connection with the Jewish, the sort of the ancient values, if you like, traditional Jewish values, and contemporary liberal values, and the fact that I think for Begin, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong with this, my sense, for Begin, there was no contradiction between the two. In fact, they mutually reinforce each other.
100%. I think that that's a critical understanding. And in many, many ways, he was probably maybe the single Israeli politician I can think of that not only understood that there was no contradiction between what we would regard as universal values versus particular Jewish values, not at all, but also that there was for him almost a flip. And that for me means that the connection to universal values actually came deeply from his anchoring in particular Jewish values. So whereas many in my realm of, my world of human rights and international law may connect to the particular identity and heritage and memory of the Jewish people from the place of universal values of human rights, of international law, it actually, in many, many ways, was the first time that we had a leader that understood that not only is there no contradiction between the two, but that the universal values that he espoused to, that he was committed to advancing, actually were anchored deeply in his particular identity. And that moves us directly into what Zionist identity actually means and what Zionism is and the misunderstandings about Zionism that have led us in many ways to the place that we are today. But that understanding was deeply seeped. So if I speak about the international rules-based order post-World War II that actually were created to uphold, promote, and protect these universal values, for Begin, that was anchored deeply in Jewish memory, in the Jewish story, in what he carried that was so intrinsic to who he was. And from that place, the commitment to universal values was unequivocal and was a continuum of, as you said, without a contradiction between the two.
Right. Okay, so let's get to that Zionism question because, as I said in my introduction, until recently you were dealing very much with the problem of anti-Semitism, and it's very much its contemporary manifestation in many places of anti-Zionism, especially in the last couple of years, as we know. And how do you see the question of the liberal national question, if you like, as being tied into that failure to understand general ignorance of Zionism?
So we have to be very clear. Zionism, a progressive national liberation movement that enabled the return of what's very important to underscore, a prototypical indigenous people. That's what Jews are, not European colonialists, not sent by someone to occupy someone else's land, not settlers, not literally, indigeneity has meaning. It too has actually been hijacked, but indigeneity meaning the thousands of year old people that speak the same language, Hebrew, and read the same book, the Bible, and traverse the same land, Israel, and practice the same customs and rituals. That is literally the meaning of indigeneity and the understanding that Zionism, that more than 140-year-old progressive national liberation movement, was anchored deeply in thousands of years of prayer and yearning and longing of our ancestors to return to Zion and Jerusalem. It didn't sort of, come from nowhere and become something that just enabled randomly the return of this prototypical indigenous people to our ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution in a country that is committed to equality. That's just Israel's Declaration of Independence. Again, Ben-Gurion deeply understanding that the connection to the universal values come from a deep particular place of identity, of story, of memory that is actually told in the Declaration of Independence. So when you understand that, I actually view very much what's happened in the last 2 years as just the brutal removal of masks, if you will, of the unconventional war for public opinion that was waged, and we're about to mark 50 years to the 1975 Zionism is racism UN resolution. That's fundamental to understanding the systematic nature of this unconventional war for public opinion that systematically hijacked, redefined, inverted, weaponized international rules-based order that I referred to before, international institutions, principles that were created and entrusted in a post-World War II reality, among other things, to ensure that never again. The understanding that Zionism is racism passed in the UN, and we have to be very clear in this, and if anybody wants to sort of understand the Orwellian nature of that moment, I invite you not only to, watch our own Ambassador Herzog at the UN then ripping up and saying this for us is but a piece of paper, but in fact, to watch Patrick Moynihan's speech, the then US ambassador to the UN, who understands the obscenity of the moment in which a few things, but not only is there an adoption of Nazi ideology passed as a UN resolution, because Zionism is not racism. Anti-Zionism is racism, if you will. Nazi ideology that had us, the Jewish people, which I've said intentionally, a prototypical indigenous people, not a race. That's literally not what we are. The adoption of that Nazi ideology on one hand, and on the other hand, Soviet propaganda, then alive and well before 1975, including the protocols of the Elders of Zion in this intersection that, by the way, we're seeing play out on the streets, on the campuses, on social media platforms in 2025 reality in response to, if you will, the October 7 massacre that launched this multi-front war on the state of Israel. So it's a very important notion for me to actually relay to your audience that this is not just the past 2 years, that anti-Zionism as a sort of intentional, I'll call it opening shot of an unconventional war for public opinion that was waged after a series of conventional wars from 1948 to 1973, openly declaring intent to annihilate Israel, failed in their intent. That 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution is important because it allows us to understand the nature and the systematic danger of the hijacking of the international institutions and principles, which Patrick Moynihan then actually anticipates. And you can hear the absolute grotesque nature and understanding of what this moment represents, where he makes clear that if Nazism is racism and Zionism is racism, then it won't be very long before Zionism is equated with Nazism. Welcome to 2025. And so that for me is very important. And the understanding that then, if I fast forward so that we don't, dwell too much on the systematic nature of the hijacking, as I refer to it, of international law and its institutions and its principles, if I fast forward to the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, again, a UN conference in none other than Durban, South Africa, when you understand that that resolution, though it had been rescinded by the UN, blood libel has this way of sticking around. It's like the conspiracy theory of anti-Semitism always allows blood libel to stick. So Zionism,
and I'm sure far more people know about the resolution than know that it was rescinded.
100%. Right. Well, as we know, in today's world, when lies make their way a full way around the world before the truth even can begin to strap its boots on, as they say, of course, indeed, that is the case. But no matter, because once it's stuck, Zionism is racism, and there is no acceptable world in which, certainly in 2025, you walk into a room and say, I am a racist. But that is what people hear, so that when I travel around the world, including well before October the 7th and before I was in the role of Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism, to talk about the imperative of combating anti-Semitism with international law and human rights on the streets of New York City, in the entrance to NYU Law, what it said on the sidewalk when I came to talk about anti-Semitism and combating it with international law and human rights was Zionists not welcome. Because if Zionism is racism, racists are not welcome into NYU Law. But as I was saying, then if you fast forward to the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, if we accept the lie, the blood libel, number one, the opening shot of the unconventional war for public opinion, that Zionism is racism, then a conference against racism turns into an anti-Semitic hate fest. Because if Zionism is racism and the conference is against racism and the two are synonymous, you can understand that anti-Zionism, this modern mutated strain of an ever-mutating hate that anti-Semitism is, that as Professor Wistrich called it, the longest hatred in the world, that mutates by latching onto the guiding social construct of each time, as the late Rabbi Sachs explained so well, religion, science, and the secular religion of our times, international law and human rights. Well, Israel as an apartheid state is born out of the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, after which, for the last 24 years, across campuses around the world in the US, Canada, Europe, Israel Apartheid Weeks have been held every single year. It means that blood libel number one, Zionism is racism, was just the opening shot, because for the last 24 years worth of graduates from universities around the world, Israel as an apartheid state has become what we know of as the new blood libel. Israel's an apartheid state. And I'll say, you spoke about October the 7th in the last 2 years. In the most Orwellian inversion of fact and of law, I would say is the hijacking, the redefinition, the inversion, and the weaponization of the term genocide, indeed of the Holocaust itself. Genocide, coined by Raphael Lemkin, whose entire family is annihilated in Auschwitz, alongside crimes against humanity by Lauterpacht, utilized, hijacked, as I said, to seat Israel on the dock of the accused by none other than South Africa. Remember the Durban Conference Against Racism, in none other than the International Court of Justice, that was intended to be a court of last resort, but has become a kangaroo court that has been politicized so deeply. And when you look at the representatives of that court, you understand that it is no longer administering law in the way that law has to be administered or upheld equally and consistently. Seated on the dock of the accused at the ICJ, utilizing the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide that Lemkin actually dedicated his entire life to. And guess who was amongst the first signatories in 1948? Of course, the State of Israel. And so the Jew among nations, Dreyfus, seated on the docket of the accused in the aftermath of the worst attack since the Holocaust, with openly declared genocidal intent, war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated on October the 7th, and in the war that was waged on that day. We sometimes make the mistake of focusing singularly on October the 7th. October the 7th was the opening shot of a multi-front war. We'll say we speak about 7 fronts of war, but the 8th front continued raging all along, whether at the ICJ, whether in the Amnesty International reports and the human rights infrastructure, whether on university campuses, streets, and online, with signs that actually were, from my perspective, wrongly assumed to be pro-Palestinian, because as I've said in interviews everywhere, if they were pro-Palestinian, they would be protesting to free Gaza from Hamas, a genocidal terror organization for whom human tragedy is the strategy, that uses its own people as human shields, as sacrifices. But that's not what we saw on the streets of Western capitals. That is not the responses that actually fueled genocidal terror organizations and their patrons, including the Islamic regime in Iran, and including Qatar, and including where anti-Semitism intersects as this Mein Kampf anti-Semitism in the Hamas charter. And of course, the other proxies of that criminal Islamic regime in Iran, the Houthis, Hezbollah, joining in the 7-front war, while the 8th front continues to rage without ceasefire. And I want to just underscore, for over 50 years, as we will mark on November the 10th, as I said, the Zionism is Racism resolution that continued or that enabled the mutation of the modern strain that explains the tsunami of anti-Semitism. Yes, explains a tsunami of anti-Semitism that got me on planes days after October the 7th, knowing that we need to be able to predict and hopefully prevent, which I'll say the international community colossally failed, the tsunami that was or should have been anticipated. Because as I said at the UN a month after October the 7th was the Kristallnacht moment of our times. And the question became what the world would do in response to the Kristallnacht moment of our times. And what we've seen in response is not only the tsunami of anti-Semitism enabled by silence, including in the international organizations and institutions, not only by denial, not only by their justification, right? Rape is armed resistance. Me too, unless you're a Jew. Complete silence in what we have seen in the 2 years since of the infrastructure created and entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect these foundational principles of liberal democracies equally and consistently. But what we have seen is actually the normalization of anti-Semitism, if you will, including its modern mutated mainstream strain of anti-Zionism that is, in fact, racism. Not Zionism is racism, anti-Zionism is racism, for all of the reasons that Patrick Moynihan says exceptionally well 50 years ago, and the connection to the imperative to reclaim what Zionism is and what Zionist identity represents, that Menachem Begin so deeply understood, becomes that much more important.
Yeah, that's really well said. I mean, if anyone doubts the success, the tragic success of Zionism is racism 50 years later, we're probably, I mean, our listeners will know this by the time they listen to this, probably, but probably on the verge of a proud anti-Zionist being elected mayor of the largest Jewish city outside of Israel, which is horrific. But there you go.
And I'll say a dangerous moment, as the late Rabbi Sachs says, anti-Semitism is the most reliable sign of a major threat to humanity, freedom, and the dignity of difference. Meaning, if we think that that is a problem for Jews, for
Yeah.
Zionists, for Israel, New York City, meaning the center of, I would say, all that cherish life and liberty is actually what is threatened by the notion that a self-declared communist is going to not only, in a few days we'll know, but likely become the mayor, but proudly calling to globalize the Intifada, proudly appearing in songs that support Hamas, proudly wearing a Nazi tattoo, and proudly, actually, we heard the other day, peddling good old traditional anti-Semitism, including that the NYPD, its boots are strapped by the IDF, meaning
Yeah, I saw that.
there is something much, much deeper
Mm.
and much more insidious than the fact that that will be the mayor of New York City, and it should trouble all who cherish, as I said, humanity, freedom, and the dignity of difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when we look at sort of liberal nationalism, the two elements of that, and we can think of, the failure of people to understand. One way of explaining the failure to understand Zionism is because we're in something of a post-national
That's
moment,
right.
and nationalism.
Intersecting completely with that. You're right.
And nationalism is a sort of dirty word in many senses, or misunderstood, or associated only with the bad version of nationalism, rather than sort of nationalism in its progressive or liberal form that was really Zionism was part of that zeitgeist, 150 years ago or so. But it's also a failure, I think, of liberalism, and a failure of liberals, because when we talk about what you've just spoken about so eloquently, all these things are happening in liberal democracies. These are happening in Western Europe and in the United States and Canada and Australia. That's what we're talking about. So it's in these liberal states, and in the most liberal of these states, right? New York, for example, London. So how do you? I'm interested. In your previous role, you would have met with politicians and others in these countries. How did you even attempt to explain to them the extent to which this is a absolute failure of liberal democracy and liberal values? What's
Look,
happening in their countries?
So I'll say long before, and including as an MK, but even before that as a researcher and what was happening in university spaces, we have to be actually, to be blunt, trillions of Qatari dollars pouring into American universities does not bode well for the values that universities are meant to actually represent, right?
Fair enough.
Forget the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of knowledge. If we're in a post-truth era, you can't even say that. The pursuit
Right.
of knowledge at the very least, though we should pause for a second on what that means, that you can no longer say the pursuit of truth. And it does intersect with what you mentioned before in this post-nation state era, that including the former Prime Minister of Canada informed us that over 10 years ago, that we now live in a post-nation state Israel. And I just said, when I was quoting the Declaration of Independence, that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. So
Right.
here it intersects, big time with all kinds of other issues. But I will say the understanding that all of this could have been predicted and therefore prevented is on one hand devastating, and on the other hand is a call to action, including, and I would say, bearing more responsibility than any who self-declare to espouse to liberal values, meaning the understanding that it's your liberal values that have been, and I've tried to make accessible, systematically hijacked,
Right.
redefined, which you don't need to be a lawyer to understand that the reason that laws begin with definitions is we need to all be on the same page. You can't just redefine something and not tell anybody, because otherwise the paper it's written on ceases to exist. It's irrelevant. Redefined, inverted, and used or weaponized, in this case, to demonize, delegitimize, apply double standards to the Jew among nations that is the state of Israel. But as I said, those three features, actually the mechanism that enables the mutation of anti-Semitism over thousands of years of this, the existence of this lethal hate, demonization, delegitimization, application of double standards, those three Ds, Natan Sharansky's three Ds in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, those should actually be a call to action to anybody who espouses to liberal values, understanding that if we do not ensure the equal and consistent application and implementation of those values, then they are, as I said, collapsed, meaning what the responses to October the 7th and the war that was waged on that day, existential war, multi-front war, and I mentioned not just the seven fronts, but this eighth front, have exposed is that all who cherish those liberal values have a now ringing siren, or should be ringing siren, for the values that they believe are fundamental to the spaces that they inhabit in Canada, in the United States, in Europe. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, of none other than France, are collapsed because the collapse of morality and the understanding that that is what that infrastructure was created. That is why those universal values, if we go back to the beginning of the conversation, yes, anchored in our particular memory, we know why those liberal values have been created in a way that would maybe make them accessible to what we would call the secular religion of human rights.
Yeah.
But without them, they fail to protect anybody. And so that has been my call to action, throughout my time, whether as, I could, pseudo-academic researching the attempt to regulate speech on university campuses that began long, long ago, whether it was as legislator, including in co-founding the Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Anti-Semitism at the time, recognizing that what happens online, we haven't even spoken about that, but what happens online with anti-Semitism as a predictor emboldens the extremes, right? The business model of social media platforms, polarizing and fragmentizing to keep eyeballs engaged. It's a business model. It's not anything that we should be ignoring, because what it means is that the extremities, the extremes, it doesn't matter to me, by the way, what side of the spectrum the extreme comes from. I say all the time, anti-Semitism has one definition. I mentioned it, the IRA working definition. It enables to identify all, right now, 11 examples, 11 strains of this lethal, ever-mutating hate, whether they come from what's known as the extreme right, the extreme left, the extreme Islamist. There is one definition, and that one definition predicts what it is that should trouble everybody, which is extremism. In that sense, there is an intersection of, what I've, done in the engagement, including with that bipartisan, multi-partisan task force to combat online anti-Semitism. I say sadly that, when I stopped serving in Knesset, the task force didn't continue its work in holding social media companies to account, because I think that there's a big part in what we've seen, including in the last 2 years, by the way, that has been exposed as the national security threat, that extremism utilizing the platforms that they can use just like anybody else without transparency, being a keyword that we are lacking at the moment vis-a-vis social media companies, has enabled in being able to predict and failing to prevent the impact and the implications of allowing extremism to dictate our discourse. The silver lining, if you will, is that I do truly, including after the last 2 years as Israel Special Envoy, a role in which I served in a voluntary capacity, and I actually think is very important for the state of Israel to recognize as much beyond the role that I played in that voluntary capacity. The understanding that there is this moderate majority public around the world that recognizes that something is very wrong in their own liberal democracies, in their own neighborhoods, institutions, universities, but does not necessarily have access to being able to connect the dots. I think that the role and responsibility, in many ways, it's part of what I hope to be able to do more effectively from the platform of the International Legal Forum, because the law transcends real or perceived differences of geography and of religion and of politics if it is equally and consistently applied. And it is the law that was hijacked and weaponized to actually collapse democracies from within, to actually bring the demise of civilization without needing to use one bullet or one gun. In many ways, recognizing that the strengths of democracies, including our own, but that the strengths of democracies can easily be used as weaknesses to collapse them from within. And in that sense, an international legal forum that identifies anti-Semitism as what I believe it is, both a symptom and a tool to actually not only enable Israel to rise from the docket of the accused, as I described before, Dreyfus seated on the accused, demonized, delegitimized, applied double standards to, but in many ways to enable democracies to reclaim and to enable all who self-identify small case liberal to reclaim those foundational principles that we so cherish of life and of liberty.
Okay, so I know we have to finish soon, but I'll maybe we'll conclude with this last question. So I want to look a little further afield now, and my contention with this whole series actually is that Israeli liberal nationalism, or Begin Jabotinsky liberal nationalism, actually has a lot to teach other countries as well. And I think that in the country that I know best, other than Israel, which is the country of my birth, in Britain, I think you're seeing exactly what you refer to now, which is the sort of moderate, silent majority who are really fed up with the idea of Britain and British patriotism, let's say, being dismissed or denigrated or seen as somehow synonymous with racism or xenophobia or whatever. Not to say that there aren't obviously racists and xenophobes that hijack that's a given, but this idea that national identity and it should be something that we should be embarrassed about. I think that Israel is such a wonderful model of a liberal democracy in which, people are not ashamed to wave the flag and people rally around the flag. And actually, without getting into politics for sure, but if you go back to the very divided period of judicial reform, what was interesting and fascinating and I think very encouraging was that both sides waved the Israeli flag, right? Both sides, wherever you stood on the issue, saw their goal as a patriotic goal. It wasn't like, anti-government protests in the UK or the United States where they're trashing their country's history and tearing up the stars and stripes or whatever. Here it was not like that at all. And I think that, for me, there's something so valuable that Israeli liberal nationalism has to teach other countries. So maybe just your thoughts on that before we finish.
So actually, I agree with you 100%. Not just from my perspective, not just has to, but actually not just can, but has to, as you said in your final line of the question. Because in many, many ways, Israeli national liberalism enables to reconnect to, I spoke about Natan Sharansky's 3Ds. So I very often end my talks with the understanding that what it enables to do, this thousands of year long history of which we not only remember the story and have to remember the story, right? I mentioned the Declaration of Independence because the story is all there. It's not just that latter part of the story of Israel and by the way, it also, if you turn the lens inwards, explains or intersects with some of those protests you're referring to, right? So This is incumbent upon our generation as still the 77-year young state of Israel to which we returned after thousands of years of exile and persecution that is committed to equality. That is the role and responsibility of our generation to build, if you will, the next tier of this shared project, by the way, with Jews from around the world, right? There's less than 16 million of us around the world, whether we live here or not. We have a tremendous challenge in making accessible the story and the imperative to remember. So when I speak with hundreds of students around the world, including Jewish students, the understanding that Zionism is racism and Israel's an apartheid state that is committing genocide, starvation, famine is so deep that actually we know that there are Jews as well that are willing to actually, or convinced to actually, or choosing to actually shed their Zionist pound of flesh in order to be good Jews or good human beings. The thing with memory is we recognize we've been here before. So the understanding that shedding the relevant loathed pound of flesh, whether it attached itself to religion, to science, which you couldn't really shed, hence the Nazis and the final solution, and I would argue Zionism too, you can try and shed it, but the ultimate outcome, as we remember very well, is not that you are then a good human being. You are still just a Jew, which is what we've seen around the world, meaning
Yeah.
how do you explain that a father in Montreal in broad daylight is beaten to a pulp with his 5-year-old little girl hiding behind a rock wearing a kippah? And not only does nobody intervene or nobody call, but people then say it's because of what's happening in Israel. How do you explain that? So you can choose or opt out or shed your Zionist pound of flesh, but those who will identify this ever mutating hate with you will still target those that are identified, whether as Jew or, by the way, as Zionist. You need not be a Jew to be the target of this strain of anti-Semitism. I say that all the time as one of my silver linings. You need just believe in Israel's right to exist, right? Because anti-Zionism doesn't ask you if you're a Jew. You may be an identifiable Jew, or you may self-identify as a Zionist or be identified as a Zionist. I don't know, my friend Congressman Richie Torres, not a Jew, identified as a Zionist, is actually the recipient of very much the same kind of hate as I am. But to go back to your question, the understanding that Israel has not only and I'll say, and the Jewish people have not only the ability but the responsibility to go back to my 3 R's: remember, reclaim, and renew. Not only remember and remind the story of the Jewish people. Rabbi Sacks says it's memory, it's not history, that we are commanded to every single holiday to actually indoctrinate, inculcate, remember about our story, right? Our story is our memory. It's not history, his story. It's memory. It's mine. The understanding that you have to remember, including in spaces that committed to the universal values, not necessarily that came from our particular sense of history, heritage, identity, but universal values have to be remembered. What is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? How did we arrive there? So remember is a key part of that. Reclaiming what I've referred to as the hijacking of those foundational principles is key. It's fundamental to actually being able to protect the post-World War II international rules-based order, even as very, very distinct forces, of some of which we saw on the October 7th massacre, of barbarism that intend to build an alternate reality on the rubble of civilization. They say it openly. You just need to follow them on Twitter because they can actually post what they think, what they're planning on doing regularly, whether it be Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others, and of course their patrons. The understanding that you have to reclaim what it was that was hijacked and actually return what it was that they were defined as, including, and we've mentioned some of the terms, genocide has a definition, racism has a definition, apartheid has a definition, but all of those institutions need to be reclaimed. If I share one of the most perverse realities of 2025 reality, it's that Iran has been named as a senior advisor to the Human Rights Council of the UN. That is not something that I should be able to say without saying I'm joking. It didn't happen. But that's the reality in which we live. So the reclamation of what those institutions, principles, and agencies were meant to uphold, promote, and protect have to be reclaimed. And finally, I speak about the last R, the renewal of the covenant. And for me, the renewal of a covenant, when I speak internally to the Jewish people, it's the renewal of the covenant, not just the covenant of fate, which for thousands of years bound us together. Anti-Semitism or hate, the outside, bound us together with this covenant of fate. I think that we are perhaps the first generation in thousands of years of Jewish history that can lean into and realize what the late Rabbi Soloveitchik refers to as the covenant of destiny, meaning that is choice. And that covenant of destiny actually enables us to be what you refer to, taking this role and responsibility to this national liberalism that allows other countries to reclaim what it is that their shared values are and must be. Look, you talked before about, those that may hijack this for all kinds of other racist speech. First of all, the good thing about anti-Semitism and its definition is, as I said, it allows me to transcend and say, I don't care where it comes from, extreme right, extreme left, extreme Islamist. One definition as a looking glass And if you're willing to adopt the IRA and implement it to identify anti-Semitism, by the way, in your own backyard, if you're, what's defined as the right or defined as the left or defined as whatever it is, then identify in your own backyard. But the second piece of that, and the deeper piece of that anti-Semitism is just the looking glass through which we look, is actually that for shared values, meaning it's not about immigration. It was never about immigration. That is not the problem. Neither immigrants nor immigration is the problem. What is the problem is integration or lack of integration. And for integration to actually be allowed, enabled, committed to, you need to have a shared sense of values. And here we are back at national liberalism that enables to say, of course you're welcome, whether it's liberté, égalité, fraternité in France, whether it's the Bill of Rights in Canada, whether it's the UK's foundational principles that allowed at the time, and we know Churchill's warning to Chamberlain, you were given the choice between dishonor and war, you chose dishonor and you will have war, that enabled the people to understand that they were fighting for their lives. And I actually think we're at that intersection where our responsibility is not to actually isolate ourselves. And in many, many ways, that's the intent, right? With BDS, you mentioned some of those sort of expressions of removing Jewish visibility from public spaces. I actually think we have to do precisely the opposite. We have to outreach. We cannot be a people that dwell alone to actually serve our role and responsibility at this existential moment for all who cherish life and liberty as we actually do. The understanding that the role that we have to play demands that we reach out and identify that moderate majority public that is either silent or silenced. And there are so many examples every single day that instead of being removed from public spaces, I mean, just you mentioned, the UK, so Professor Bengad, who says, oh, no, I'm not taking a leave of absence. Thank you very much. I will show up to every one of my classes from here on in. By the way, post ceasefire in this virulent attack of, again, the same masked mob that enters his class and also threatens to behead him. That is the moment that we're in. And it leaves me with, sort of the final message that I think is very important that we relay to each of us as boots on the ground in this. And that is Rabbi Sacks's differentiation between hope and optimism. And I think you've heard me quote him on this because it really motivates me in everything that I do, where optimism is the belief that everything will be okay. Hope is the belief that together we can make it okay. So in that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue and hope is a very active one. And it takes not very much courage to be an optimist, but a great deal of courage to have hope. And of course, the reminder not only that our national anthem is Hatikva, is the hope, but it is the hope that has carried our people for thousands of years of trials and tribulations, and that we have the responsibility to actually continue holding on to as it holds us. I think that the last 2 years have really showcased the resilience of an incredible generation of heroes in this country. And our generation's responsibility is actually to champion what they've done on the battlefront, including on this 8th front that I'm referring to, so that we can reclaim national liberalism and renew the covenant to those shared principles.
Michal Kotler-Wunsch, thank you so much. You're a fantastic thinker and doer on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people, and I think also of liberalism properly understood. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, for having me on. Thank you.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.